Chapter 1, The Knock at 3:33 a.m. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. If you've been around a while, you already know the drill. I tell it straight. No jump scares for the sake of them. No fake based on a true story disclaimers when it's not. But this one still keeps me up some nights. Grab something strong, turn the lights down low, and don't pause halfway through, because once it starts, stopping feels like a bad idea. It was one of those Atlanta November nights where the rain doesn't fall so much as it hangs in the air, thick and reluctant, like the city itself is holding its breath. The kind of weather that turns every alley into a throat and every streetlight into a dying cigarette. Our office sits at the ass end of Harmon Alley, wedged between a laundromat that never has change and a donut shop that's been closed for renovations since 2019. No sign on the door. If you're here, you were meant to find it. Inside. The place smells like it always does. Burnt coffee grounds, wet cardboard, and the faint copper tang of old blood that never quite washes out of the floorboards. Clive was slumped over his desk, mouth open, snoring in that wet, obnoxious way that makes me wonder why I haven't fired him yet. 23 years old, convinced every shadow has a LinkedIn profile in hell. His laptop screen was still glowing with some forum thread titled Vatican Secret Archives, What They're Hiding in Sub-Basement 7. Kid never sleeps when he's onto something or thinks he is. I was at my desk, the oak one with the cigarette burns and the knife scar shaped like Florida, nursing a mug of coffee that had gone cold sometime around midnight. The radiator hissed like it was trying to confess something. Outside, thunder rolled low and slow, the way it does when God's clearing his throat. That's when the knocking started. 7 knocks, precise, evenly spaced, like someone counting out rosary beads with a hammer. Then silence, then one more, not hesitant, not polite, deliberate. Clive jolted awake, eyes wide, hair sticking up like he'd been electrocuted. Boss? I was already moving, gun in my hand before I reached the door. Old habits from cases that didn't end with holy water and Latin. The peephole was cracked years ago, some goblin with a grudge and a crowbar, so I pressed my ear to the wood instead. Nothing, just the rain. I opened the door. He fell inward like a sack of broken stained glass. A priest. Cassock torn to shreds. Black fabric hanging off him in wet ribbons. Blood everywhere. His face. His hands. Soaking through the white collar that used to mean something. The stench hit me first. Iron and incense. Like someone had slaughtered a cathedral. He was clutching a titanium case to his chest with both arms, the kind they use for nuclear codes or organ transports. A thick chain ran from the handle to a cuff around his left wrist. The metal was scratched to hell, like something with claws had tried to pry it open. His eyes found mine, wild, terrified. Latin spilling from his lips, too fast to follow. Something about claves and infernum and peccatorum. Then, in English, barely a whisper. They followed me from Rome. Then he collapsed. Clive was behind me now, breathing like he'd run a marathon. Jesus Christ. Adam, is he alive? Barely. I knelt. Pressed 2 fingers to the priest's neck, pulse racing but steady. The blood was fresh, but I couldn't find the wounds. His skin was ice under my fingers. Help me get him inside. We dragged him across the threshold. The door swung shut on its own. Old building. Bad hinges. Nothing unusual, except the bell above it didn't jingle. Not once. That's when I noticed his eyes. They were open, staring up at the water-stained ceiling like he was reading something written there in a language only the dying can see. I tilted his head gently, checking for pupil response with my phone light, and froze. His pupils weren't dilated. They weren't blown. They were inverted, perfect upside-down crosses, black on white, etched into the iris like someone had taken a branding iron to his soul, the kind of thing you don't see in medical textbooks, the kind that makes you question if what you're looking at is still human. Clive made a sound behind me, half gag, half prayer. Boss, his eyes. I see them. The priest's lips moved again. No sound this time, just shaping words I could read clear as day. Don't open the case. Too late for warnings. The case was right there, chained to his wrist like it had grown there. Titanium, cold to the touch, heavier than it should be. And on the lid, pressed into red wax the color of arterial blood, was the Vatican seal. 2 keys crossed beneath the papal tiara, official, authentic. But the wax was still warm, not cooling, not soft, warm, like it had been poured minutes ago, from the inside. I stared at it for a long second. Rain hammered the windows like fists, somewhere in the walls. The radiator gave a sound that might have been laughter, Clive whispered. Adam, what the hell did we just let in? I didn't answer. Couldn't, because the chain around the priest's wrist was starting to rattle, not from him moving, from something inside the case trying to get out. Chapter 2, The Tongue That Whispers, Latin Backwards. You ever have one of those moments where you know, deep in your gut, that crossing a line is going to cost you something you can't pay back? Yeah, this was one of those. The priest, Father Matteo Ricci, I found his passport later, soaked in blood and tucked inside his cassock like contraband, was laid out on the ratty couch we usually reserve for clients who've seen too much and need to throw up quietly. His breathing had steadied into something shallow but regular, the kind that says the body's clinging on by fingernails. Clive kept glancing at him like he expected the man to sit bolt upright and start speaking in tongues, which, given the upside-down crosses burned into his eyes, wasn't entirely off the table. The titanium case sat on my desk like a loaded gun. I told myself I was just checking the lock. Professional curiosity, evidence protocol, bullshit. I wanted to know why a man would cross an ocean chained to something and collapse on my doorstep, begging me not to look inside. Clive hovered, wringing his hands. Boss, he said not to open it, like with his actual dying breath. He's not dead yet, I muttered, running my fingers over the Vatican seal again. The wax was cooling now, but the heat lingered in the metal underneath, like the case had a fever, and if whatever's in here followed him from Rome, we need to know what we're dealing with before it decides to introduce itself. Clive swallowed hard. Or we could call someone, like, I don't know, the Pope? I gave him the look that usually shuts him up. It didn't work this time. I'm serious, Adam. That's Holy See property. We open it. We're basically robbing God. God's got bigger problems, I said, and snapped the chain with bolt cutters I keep in the drawer next to the bourbon and the spare 38. The cuff around Father Ricci's wrist fell away with a dull clank. His arm flopped lifelessly, revealing fresh bruises shaped like fingerprints, too large for human hands. The case had two combination locks, both set to 0333. Of course they were. I spun the dials. The lid hissed open like it had been holding its breath. Inside, nested in black velvet, gone stiff with old blood, was a small ossuary, child-sized, carved from what looked like human thigh bone, yellowed and cracked with age. A faint inscription circled the lid in Latin, so old the letters had worn soft. Lingua peccatoris sancti, the tongue of the sinful saint. Clive leaned in, breath fogging in the sudden cold that poured out. That's not normal bone. No, it wasn't. I lifted the lid with the barrel of my gun. The smell hit first. Church incense and slaughterhouse copper, sweet and wrong, nestled on a bed of crumbled myrrh, was the thing itself. A human tongue, blackened like it had been charred in fire, yet still plump, still wet. A splinter of wood the length of my thumb had been driven straight through the center, pinning it to a tiny block of olive wood. The splinter was dark, ancient, scarred with what might have been old nail holes. Clive whispered, "They say that's from the true cross, the actual one." "People say a lot of things," I replied, but my voice sounded distant, like someone else was using my mouth. Moonlight from the window sliced across the desk, just a sliver through the blinds. But the second it touched the tongue, fresh blood welled up around the splinter, bright red, arterial. It beaded, then ran in slow rivulets down the blackened flesh, like the thing was crying. Clive stumbled back. "Did you see that? It's bleeding. Right now." I slammed the lid shut. The bleeding stopped instantly, but the smell lingered, thick in the back of my throat. Father Ricci stirred on the couch. His lips moved, no sound, but I read them clear enough. "You've killed us all." We moved the ossuary to the office safe. An old Mosler I inherited from the previous tenant, who swore it once held Al Capone's ledgers. Clive kept glancing at it like it might grow legs. I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. That was the first night. Around 2:17 a.m. the whispering started, soft. So soft you could almost convince yourself it was the radiator, or the rain, or Clive's snoring, but it wasn't. It came from the safe, Latin, low and rhythmic, rising and falling like a lullaby sung at a funeral. Clive woke up first this time. He sat bolt upright, eyes wide. "You hear that?" I was already at the safe, ear pressed to the cold steel. Petri, ter negibus, antequam gallus cantet. "Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows." Clive had his phone out recording before I could tell him not to. Kid's got instincts. I'll give him that. We played it back at half speed, normal forward. It was just whispers, reversed. It was a children's rhyme, sung in a child's voice, high, sweet, and utterly wrong. "Rock-a-bye, Peter, on the treetop, when the cock crows, your faith will drop when the dawn breaks and the keys fall down. Rock-a-bye, Peter, Rome burns to the ground." We stared at each other. The office felt smaller suddenly, colder. Then came the jump. I'd opened the safe to check the tongue hadn't, I don't know, crawled out on its own, moonlight again, stronger now, full beam across the desk. The ossuary lid was cracked open, just a finger's width. I hadn't left it that way. The tongue was moving, not twitching, moving. The tip curled upward, slow and deliberate, like it was tasting the air. Then it licked the splinter, once, twice, a wet, obscene sound in the silence. Blood smeared across the wood where the muscle dragged. Clive made a strangled noise and dropped his phone. I slammed the lid so hard the desk jumped, locked the safe, spun the dial 3 times for good measure, but the licking sound didn't stop. It was coming from inside Father Ricci's mouth. His jaw hung slack in unconsciousness. And there, in the dark cavity, something black and slick moved against his teeth, tasting the air like a snake. He hadn't had a tongue when he arrived. I checked. Chapter 3, The Polaroids That Develop in Blood. If you're still here after the last 2 chapters, you're braver than most, or maybe just as stubborn as I am. Either way, stick around. Things are about to get a lot more personal. And if you've ever wondered what it feels like to have the Vatican watching you through a lens that isn't theirs, well, pay attention. The days after we locked that tongue in the safe, blurred together like smeary fingerprints on a crime scene photo. Father Ricci, Matteo, as his blood-crusted passport confirmed, drifted in and out of consciousness on the couch, muttering fragments of Latin that made Clive cross himself, even though he's about as Catholic as a vending machine. Fever sweat soaked the cushions, carrying that same incense and copper reek that clung to the ossuary. I'd cleaned him up as best I could, stitched a gash on his scalp that looked like it came from fingernails too long and too sharp for any human hand. He hadn't woken fully since collapsing, but his inverted cross pupils had faded back to something almost normal. Almost. Clive hadn't slept much. Kid was obsessed, scrolling through grainy scans of Vatican exorcism protocols on his laptop, whispering about suppressed rites from the 17th century that involved nailing sinful body parts to relics. "It's a binding thing," he said one afternoon, eyes bloodshot. "Like, the splinter from the true cross pins the sin in place so it can't spread. But if the sin's too big, if it's something that got into the church itself..." I told him to shut up and make coffee. Strong, black, the kind that tastes like regret. We kept the office blinds drawn tight. Atlanta's gray November light felt wrong now, too thin, like it was being filtered through stained glass that hadn't been cleaned since the Reformation. The whispering from the safe had stopped after that second night, but the silence was worse, expectant, like the tongue was holding its breath, waiting for us to blink first. It was a Thursday, or maybe Friday. The calendar on the wall had stopped turning pages when the first envelope showed up. I found it just after dawn, slid under the door like a bill we couldn't pay. Plain manila, no writing on the outside, thick paper, the kind that hasn't been made since the 80s. Inside, a single Polaroid photograph. Clive was brewing coffee that actually smelled edible for once. I held the photo up to the light. It showed a confessional, old school Vatican style, dark carved wood, velvet kneeler worn thin from centuries of guilty knees. The grill between sinner and priest was latticework, intricate as spider silk, empty, both sides, but the angle was wrong, too intimate, like the camera had been shoved right up against the wood from the priest's side. Timestamp burned into the bottom corner in that faded orange Polaroid font. 3:33. No date, just the time. Clive peered over my shoulder. Where'd that come from? No idea. I flipped it over. Blank. No fingerprints when I dusted it. Habit. Postmark? Slid under the door. Boss? No stamp. Someone was here. We checked the hallway. Empty. The laundromat downstairs was still closed. The donut shop guy snoring behind his counter, with yesterday's racing form over his face. No footprints in the dust. No scent but old fryer grease and rain. I tacked the photo to the wall amid the newspaper clippings and missing persons posters. It looked wrong there, too clean among the chaos. That night, I dreamed of confessionals, rows of them, endless, stretching into darkness, something kneeling on the other side of every grill, breathing slow and patient. I woke to Clive shaking me. Another one, same envelope, same thickness. This Polaroid, the exact same confessional, same angle, but now, on the center's side, a shape, blurry at first, like motion blur, but no, a figure in cardinal red, hands folded in prayer. The face, there wasn't one, just a smooth void, like someone had taken an eraser to reality, where eyes and mouth should be, only pale skin stretched tight. Timestamp 3:33. The coffee in my mug had gone cold again. I didn't remember setting it down. We didn't sleep after that. Every morning, always just as the gray light started bleeding through the blinds. A new envelope, a new photo. The progression was slow, deliberate, like whatever was taking them wanted us to watch it get closer. Third photo, the cardinal figure sharper now, head tilted as if listening to confession, one hand raised in absolution, but the fingers were too long, joints bending wrong. Fourth, the void where the face should be had started to sink, like something behind the skin was pulling inward, creating a hollow that caught shadows in impossible ways. Clive started sleeping with his rosary, his grandmother's, the one he'd sworn was just for aesthetic, clutched in his fist. If you were in my shoes, he asked one night, voice cracking, would you burn the tongue? Just end it? I didn't answer, because part of me wanted to, and that scared me more than the photos. The fifth photo was different. The confessional wasn't empty on the priest's side anymore. A hand rested on the grill, pale, scarred, wearing a familiar silver ring, Father Ricci's ring, the one we'd pried off his finger when we cut the chain, same timestamp. That's when Matteo finally woke up. It was late, the kind of hour where the city holds its breath between bars closing and garbage trucks starting. He sat up slowly, like his body was borrowed. His eyes were normal now, brown and human and ancient with pain. You opened it, he said, not a question. Had to know what we were dealing with. He laughed then, a sound like dry leaves scraping concrete. You think you deal with this? This deals with you. Clive handed him water. Matteo drank like a man who'd forgotten how throats work. Tell us, I said. He stared at the wall of photos. His hand, the one with the missing ring, trembled. I didn't escape the Vatican, he whispered. I was excommunicated, cast out like a leper for stealing the tongue. Clive's eyes went wide. Why? Because I used it? Matteo's voice dropped lower. There was a cardinal high up, closer to the throne than any man should be. He started changing after a private audience. No one else saw it at first. The way his shadow moved wrong, the way he'd forget Latin mid-mass, then speak it fluent but backwards. I was called to perform the rite, unauthorized, the old one, from before they sanitized everything. He touched his eyes, where the crosses had been. It wasn't possession, not like the books. It was inversion, something wearing him like vestments. When I tried to cut it out, he gestured at the photos. It took something from me, marked me, the tongue. It was the only thing that hurt it, a relic from a saint who never existed, a child martyr whose tongue was cut out for speaking truth to a corrupt pope in 1412. The church buried the records, but the tongue, they kept it as a warning. I felt the room tilt, and you stole it. To finish what I started, his laugh was bitter, but it followed the tongue, or maybe the tongue called it. Either way, he pointed at the latest photo, the 6th, delivered while we spoke. The confessional was in our office, same angle, but now I recognized the peeling wallpaper behind it. The water stain shaped like South America. The cardinal figure sat in the sinner's booth, void face tilted toward the grill, and on the priest's side, kneeling where no one had been, 2 figures, blurry, but unmistakable, me and Clive. Timestamp 3:33. The envelope was still under the door, warm to the touch, and inside the confessional in the photo, the void where the cardinal's face should be, it wasn't empty anymore. Something was looking out, directly at the camera, directly at us. Chapter 4, the 1959 Vatican exorcism tapes nobody was meant to hear. By now, if you're still watching. You've probably paused at least once to check the locks on your doors. Good. That's smart. Because some stories don't stay on the screen. They bleed through. And this one, it's been trying to get out since before most of us were born. Father Matteo Ricci spent the next 48 hours slipping in and out of delirium on that God-forsaken couch, his skin alternating between corpse cold and furnace hot. The inverted crosses in his eyes had vanished completely, leaving behind something worse, the hollow stare of a man who'd seen behind the curtain and found out the wizard was something that ate wizards. Clive hovered like a nervous nurse, changing bandages, forcing broth down the priest's throat, whispering questions he was too scared to ask loud. Me? I paced, drank coffee that tasted like ash, stared at the wall of Polaroids that grew by one every dawn. The void-faced cardinal inching closer to the grill like he had all the time in the world. Because he did. The latest photo, the one with me and Clive, kneeling in our own office confessional, sat pinned dead center. The envelope it came in was still on my desk, the paper warm as living skin. I hadn't thrown it away. Couldn't. Evidence is evidence, even when it's a death threat from something wearing scarlet. Matteo finally spoke coherently on the 3rd night. His voice was gravel scraped over broken glass. You need to understand what you have, he rasped, clutching the silver crucifix around his neck like it was the only real thing left. The tongue isn't a relic. It's a cork, and you've pulled it. He told us about the cardinal he'd tried to exorcise, not just any cardinal, Cardinal Augusto Rinaldi. The man tipped to be the next pope before he started speaking, in voices that weren't his, how Rinaldi's private chapel in the apostolic palace had gone cold enough to frost the chalice, how his shadow on the wall had grown wings one night during Vespers. Matteo had been called in secretly. No records, no witnesses. The rite he used wasn't in any modern book. It was from the old grimoires, the ones locked away after the 1614 debacle in Venice, where 3 exorcists ended up flayed alive by something that laughed in Aramaic. The thing inside him, Matteo whispered. It didn't fight. It negotiated, said the church had been lying since the beginning, that the keys Christ promised Peter, they were never handed over, that something else took them first. Clive went pale, like, a deal? With the devil? Matteo laughed until he coughed blood. The devil is a gentleman compared to this. I needed proof, not stories, not whispers from a blackened tongue, hard evidence, the kind that gets people disappeared in Vatican City if they're caught with it. I have one contact left inside the Holy See, Brother Elias, an archivist in the Apostolic Archive, the real one, not the tourist trap they show the public. I pulled him out of a mess years ago involving a possessed Swiss guard and a bottle of absinthe. He owed me, big. I called him from a burner phone in the alley behind the donut shop, rain drumming on the dumpster like impatient fingers. Elias, I said when he picked up, voice hushed like he was already in a confessional. I need 1959, the librarian, everything. Silence. Then, you know what you're asking? I know what'll happen if I don't get it. He hung up without another word. 2 days later, a package arrived. No return address. Delivered by a kid on a bike who looked too scared to ask for a tip. Inside, a manila folder thick with redacted pages, black bars over names, dates, entire paragraphs inked out like sins, and a reel-to-reel tape in a dusty plastic case labeled in faded ink, Casetas Prohibita, 1959, non ascoltare. Clive's eyes lit up like Christmas. Boss, this is it, the real deal. We cleared the desk, pushed back the chairs. The office felt smaller with that tape sitting there, like it was sucking the air out of the room. Matteo watched from the couch, shaking his head. Don't. Whatever you do, too late for don't, I said, threading the tape onto the ancient Wollensack recorder I'd scavenged from a pawn shop in Little 5 Points, the kind with vacuum tubes that glow like demon eyes when it warms up. We hit play. At first, just static, then breathing, heavy, labored, like someone underwater. A voice, male, Italian, cultured, began to speak. Not shouting, not screaming, calm, repetitive. Le chiavi non sono mai state date a Pietro, over and over. The keys were never given to Peter. The same sentence, no variation, for minutes, then hours. The tape counter creeping like a funeral procession. 9 hours straight. According to the redacted transcript Elias included, 9 hours of the same goddamn words, delivered in a monotone that made my teeth ache. Clive leaned in, transcribing furiously. It's Latin, but it's wrong. The grammar's inverted, like the sentence is eating itself. The background noise built slowly, chairs creaking, rosaries clacking, then whispers, multiple voices, priests praying the rite of exorcism in overlapping Latin, frantic. The possessed man never stopped. Le chiavi non sono mai state date a Pietro. Historians still argue about that verse in Matthew. You know, whether Christ really meant Peter as the rock, or if it was his faith, whether the papacy has any divine claim at all. Funny how a single line in an ancient book can keep scholars up at night and drive others to madness. On the tape, the prayers grew desperate, holy water sizzling like acid on skin. Then the shift, subtle at first, the possessed voice cracked, a second layer underneath, deeper, older, laughing softly between the repetitions, and then the screams started, not human, not animal, something in between, like metal tearing. The sound of rosaries snapping, bead by bead, like bones in a garbage disposal. The tape kept going through the chaos, the exorcists shouting now, one begging forgiveness, another reciting the Our Father backward. Then silence. Abruptly, the reel spun to the end with a hollow clack. We sat there in the humming quiet, the Wollensack's tubes glowing orange. Clive exhaled shakily. That's not possible. 9 hours of one sentence, and the screams. He never finished. Every clock in the office, the wall one, my wristwatch, the digital on the microwave in the kitchenette, stopped dead, froze, all at the same instant, 3:33. The lights fused with a pop, plunging us into blackness so complete it had weight. But the tape kept playing. From the Wollensack's dead speakers came that voice again, clearer now, closer. Le chiavi non sono mai state date a Pietro. And underneath it, soft as a lover's whisper, Adam, my name, in my own voice. The temperature plummeted. Frost bloomed on the inside of the windows like white ferns. My breath plumed in front of me. Clive screamed, short, sharp, cut off like someone had clamped a hand over his mouth. The tape hissed, then laughter, the kind that starts in a child's throat and ends in something ancient and starving. In the dark, something brushed my cheek, cold fingers, smelling of myrrh and old blood. Chapter 5. The Cardinal Who Hanged Himself Upside Down. You've made it halfway through this nightmare, which means you're either tougher than I am, or you've got the lights cranked up so bright, your electric bill's crying. Good call, because what we're about to dig into isn't the kind of thing you want whispering in the dark alone. If the Polaroids made you paranoid, and the tape made you question every prayer you ever heard, this one's going to make you wonder who the real monsters are behind those Vatican walls. The office had become a tomb with better Wi-Fi. Frost from that night, with the tape, still lingered in the corners. Spiderwebbing across the windows, like the building itself was trying to seal us in. Father Matteo, now that he'd stopped looking like death warmed over, sat chained to the radiator with his own rosary at his insistence, not for restraint, for protection. The beads had turned black overnight, each one etched with tiny inverted crosses that hadn't been there before. Clive kept glancing at them like they might start bleeding. We hadn't slept properly in days. The Polaroids kept coming. The void-faced cardinal now standing in the confessional, one hand pressed against the grill as if listening for sins that hadn't been committed yet. The tongue in the safe had gone quiet, but the silence felt loaded, like the calm before a firing squad. I needed a name, a real one. The possessed librarian from 59 was ancient history, a ghost story with screams on tape. But Matteo had mentioned a modern cardinal, someone high enough to make the college sweat. If the thing was jumping bodies, or whatever the hell it did, there had to be a trail. Bodies don't just hang themselves wrong without someone noticing. Clive was already 3 energy drinks deep, his laptop screen reflecting in his bloodshot eyes like twin moons. Boss, if this is Vatican level, everything's buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa, but leaks happen, even in the Holy See. He wasn't wrong. Scandals have a way of seeping out like blood through marble. I put out feelers through the usual channels. Ex-cops turned private security for dioceses. A hacker in Naples who owed me for not turning him in over a forged indulgence scam. 24 hours later, an encrypted file hit my inbox. No subject line. Sender, a burner account named Petrusnan Clives. Inside, crime scene photos, grainy, watermarked with Italian police stamps, clearly not meant for public eyes, and a death report dated 2 weeks ago. Cardinal Augusto Rinaldi, found in his private chapel at the Domus Sanctae Marthae, the Vatican residence for cardinals. Official cause, suicide by hanging. The kind of tidy explanation that gets trotted out when questions are dangerous. But the photos, I enlarged the first one on Clive's screen. Rinaldi's body suspended from the chapel's ancient beam, toes dangling inches above a tipped-over prayer stool. He was upside down, head toward the floor, ankles bound together with what looked like red silk cord. His face, purple, bloated, eyes bulging like they'd been squeezed from the inside. But the ligature marks, they weren't around the neck in a noose pattern. They were on the front, deep furrows across the throat, angled upward, as if something invisible had wrapped fingers around his windpipe and lifted. Lifted until the spine snapped with an audible crack that one witness, a cleaning nun, claimed echoed like a bell-tolling midnight. Clive zoomed in on the cord binding the ankles. That's not silk. Look closer. I did. Woven tight braids of crimson fabric, each strand embroidered with tiny gold threads forming the papal tiara emblem, papal zucchettos, the skullcaps worn by popes and cardinals, dozens of them, unraveled and rebraided into a rope strong enough to hoist a man like a side of beef. Matteo saw the screen and crossed himself with trembling hands. Augusto, he whispered, Dio mio, it's him. The room went still. Even the radiator stopped its usual death rattle. Him who? I asked, though I already knew. The one I tried to save. Matteo's voice cracked like old leather. Rinaldi, he was changing. After a consistory in the Sistine Chapel, said he heard voices in the frescoes, Michelangelo's God reaching out. But the hand was wrong. Too many fingers. He started isolating, refusing food blessed by anyone else. Then the shadows. They moved independent of light. Clive leaned forward. You exorcised him? The cardinal from the story? Matteo nodded, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Unauthorized, in secret. He begged me. Said something had been let in during a private ritual, an old one, from before the reforms, to renew the keys. Whatever possessed him, it laughed when I invoked Peter, said the rock was a lie, that the real foundation was built on something older, hungrier. I stared at the photo again, Rinaldi's inverted body, hanging like the hanged man tarot card. In some traditions, that's not sacrifice, it's inversion, turning the world upside down, denying the natural order. The noose, Matteo continued, voice barely above a whisper. Zucchettos are symbols of authority, weaving them into the rope. It's mockery. The thing didn't kill him. It judged him, found him unworthy of the keys he thought he held. Clive's face had gone the color of week-old milk. So the cardinal you failed to exorcise ends up suicided 2 weeks before you show up bleeding on our doorstep with the one thing that hurt it? Matteo met my eyes. It didn't fail. I heard it, badly. The tongue, when I drove the splinter deeper, it screamed, fled Rinaldi's body like smoke from a censer, but not before marking me. He touched his eyes, where the crosses had been, and promising to return for what was taken. The implications hit like a gut punch. The thing hadn't followed Matteo across the ocean out of spite. It had waited for him to deliver the tongue right to fresh hosts, us. That's when the lights flickered, not the dramatic plunge into darkness. But worse, a stutter, like something testing the circuit. Clive's laptop screen glitched. The crime scene photo zoomed on its own, focusing on Rinaldi's bloated face. His eyes snapped open, not in death, in the photo, staring straight at the camera, straight at us, and his mouth moved. No sound from the speakers, but I read the lips clear as day. The keys belonged to another. The screen went black in the reflection of the dark monitor. For just a second, I saw him, Rinaldi, standing behind us in cardinal red, upside down, hanging from nothing. Chapter 6. The night every phone in the building spoke with dead popes. You're deeper into this than most people would dare, and I respect that, because by now you've probably started noticing things, little coincidences, maybe a shadow that lingered too long, or a whisper in an empty room that sounded almost like Latin. If that's happening, don't stop watching. Knowing the rest might be the only thing that keeps you safe, or dooms you, hard to tell anymore. The revelation about Cardinal Rinaldi hit us like a freight train derailed in a cathedral. Matteo wouldn't meet our eyes after that, just sat chained to the radiator with his blackened rosary, murmuring prayers that sounded more like apologies. The office air had turned thick, viscous, like breathing through wet wool soaked in holy water and decay. Clive hadn't blinked in what felt like hours, staring at the crime scene photos on his laptop until the inverted cardinal's bloated face seemed to pulse with the screen's refresh rate. We were bait, he said finally, voice flat. The whole time, Matteo didn't escape with the tongue. He was sent, like a Trojan horse with a relic in its belly. Matteo didn't deny it, just whispered, "Forgive me," over and over, until the words lost meaning. I poured bourbon with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The bottle was almost empty, again, outside. Atlanta's night pressed against the windows, rain slashing sideways like accusations. The Polaroids had stopped coming 2 dawns ago, which was worse than their arrival. Absence as threat. We tried to plan, burn the tongue, salt the office, call in favors from people who owed me for dragging demons out of their daughters or sons. But every idea circled back to the same problem. We didn't know what we were fighting, not a demon. Matteo insisted, something older, something that had been there before the keys, before Peter, before the rock the church was built on cracked underlies. Clive set up his recording rig anyway, mics in every corner, EMF detectors, the works. Kid couldn't help himself. If it speaks again, he said, we catch it. Proof, leverage. I let him. Busy hands keep the mind from eating itself. It started just after midnight, not with a bang or a scream, but with a ring, one phone, the old rotary on my desk, the one with the cracked bakelite that still smelled like the 70s. It trilled once, polite, like a wrong number at a funeral, then another, Clive's cell on the charger, then the payphone in the hallway downstairs. We'd kept it as a joke, a relic from when this place was something else. Then all of them, every phone in the building, the laundromat's ancient wall unit, the donut shop's grease-crusted corded, cells in pockets, landlines unplugged for years, even the emergency burner I kept in the safe next to the tongue, ringing, simultaneous, a chorus of bells and chimes and electronic warbles overlapping into something almost musical, like a cathedral organ played by drowning men. Clive's eyes went wide. Boss, I picked up the rotary first. Habit. The line crackled with static that smelled like ozone and frankincense. Then a voice, male, ancient, speaking Aramaic, the language Christ himself used, the one still whispered in forgotten rites. Aben de Bashmea, the Lord's Prayer. Backwards, not just reversed audio, the words themselves inverted, syllables twisted into something that clawed at the inside of my skull. Our Father became a curse. Hallowed be thy name became blasphemy. I slammed the receiver down. The ringing didn't stop. Clive had his phone to his ear now, recording with the other hand. It's all of them. Same voice. No, voices layered. He was right. Pick up any handset. And the prayer poured out. Dozens of dead pontiffs reciting in perfect, horrifying unison. Pius the Wotan's clipped precision, John XXIII's warm baritone, even voices I recognized from old newsreels. Pope's long dust, their Aramaic flawless, backwards, relentless. The temperature in the office plummeted. Frost raced across the desk like living things. My breath hung in the air, white and sharp. Matteo was on his knees now, rosary beads snapping one by one in his fists, black dust spilling between his fingers, like ash from a crematorium. Make it stop, he begged. They're not supposed to speak like this. Not them. Clive's recording app hit redline. The ringing swelled. Phones vibrating off hooks. Cells dancing across the floor like possessed insects. We unplugged everything. Yanked cords from walls. Smashed screens. Hurled batteries into the sink. The ringing continued, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. Clive played the recording back on his laptop, speakers cranked, forward. It was the backwards prayer, sickening, wrong, a sound that made my teeth ache like biting tin foil. He reversed it, the voices clarified, the Pope's speaking forward now, but the words, my full name, Adam Elias Hawthorne, repeated 666 times, followed by a single sentence, whispered in choral harmony by every dead Holy Father since the keys were forged. You kept what was promised. The laptop screen fractured, not cracked, fractured, spiderwebbing from the center like something punched it from inside the code. Matteo screamed, a raw, animal sound. Blood trickled from his ears. One phone kept ringing. We'd missed it in the chaos. Matteo's satellite phone, the Vatican-issue brick he'd carried chained to the case. It lay on the couch where he'd been sitting, screen glowing red, vibrating like a heart ripped fresh from a chest. I stared at it. Don't answer. Every instinct screamed. But I did, lifted it slow, pressed it to my ear. The voice on the other end was mine. Exact timbre, exact cadence. The slight rasp from too many nights like this. Adam, it said, calm as confession. Let me in. From the other side of the office door, the door that was already open. Standing there in the frame, nothing, just darkness, but the cold poured through like a grave exhaling, and in the reflection of the window across the room, I saw myself standing behind me, smiling with a mouth that had too many teeth. The phone in my hand went dead, but the voice lingered, soft against my ear. I'm already here. Chapter 7. The bishop who walked in wearing someone else's face. We've all heard the stories about deals with the devil, pacts signed in blood under moonlight, souls traded for power or knowledge or just one more day. But what if the deal was made centuries ago by men in robes who thought they were building an everlasting kingdom? What if the bill finally came due and the collector wore a smile that didn't belong to any human face? If you've ever trusted a priest or a church or even your own eyes, this chapter might change that forever. The office had turned into a pressure cooker of dread, the kind where every breath feels borrowed and every shadow has teeth. After the phones went silent, finally, mercifully, the silence wasn't relief. It was the hush before execution. Matteo lay slumped against the radiator. His blackened rosary crumbled to dust in his lap, chest rising and falling in shallow hitches that barely qualified as breathing. Clive sat cross-legged on the floor, headphones around his neck, replaying the reversed recording on loop, like a man trying to exorcise the sound from his skull. My name, 666 times, in the voices of dead popes. You kept what was promised. The words crawled under my skin like parasites. I hadn't moved from my desk in hours. Gun in one hand, bourbon in the other, empty now. Bottle mocking me with its hollow clink. The tongue in the safe hadn't whispered since the phones. No bleeding under moonlight, but there's no nursery rhymes in reverse. Just waiting, patient as eternity. The knock came soft, polite. 3 measured taps, the way you announce yourself at a superior's door, not 7+1, not violent, civilized. Clive froze. Matteo didn't stir. I crossed the room slow, floorboards creaking like old bones under carpet. The peephole was still cracked, but through the fracture I saw him, a man in bishop's black, purple piping on the cassock, pectoral cross gleaming under the hallway's sickly fluorescent, mid-50s, silver at the temples. The kind of face that belonged on diplomatic passports and Christmas mass broadcasts. Smile pleasant, hands folded benignly. He knocked again, same rhythm. Mr. Hawthorne, voice muffled but cultured, light Italian accent polished by years and corridors of power. A moment of your time, on urgent church business? Clive mouthed a trap. I knew it, felt it in the marrow, but traps have doors, and doors can be slammed or opened. I unchained the slide bolt, turned the knob. The temperature drop hit like stepping into a crypt in winter. Breath plumed from my lungs in white clouds. The crucifix on the wall, cheap plastic I'd picked up at a truck stop years ago, began to weep. Thick red tears oozing from the nail holes in Christ's hands and feet, dripping slow onto the peeling wallpaper. The smell, copper and myrrh, thick enough to choke on. The bishop stepped inside without waiting for invitation, smile never wavering. Grazie, the weather in Atlanta is unforgiving. His reflection in the window across the room, rain-streaked glass overlooking the alley, didn't smile back. It had no eyes, just smooth skin where sockets should be, stretched tight like a mask pulled too thin. Clive made a strangled noise. Matteo stirred on the floor, chains rattling faintly. The bishop's gaze swept the room, settling on the safe. You have something that belongs to us, the lingua peccatoris. It must be returned for the good of the church. His voice was perfect, warm, reasonable, the kind that talked nations out of wars and sinners into confession. But when he opened his mouth wider to emphasize the request, something inside moved wrong. Teeth, rows of them, small and sharp, like a child's milk teeth that had never fallen out, layered behind the adult set, glinting wet in the low light, and deeper, flicking out fast as a lizard's, a second tongue, black, forked at the tip, slick with something darker than saliva. It tasted the air, curling toward me like it could smell fear. I raised the gun, back out slow. He tilted his head, smile stretching impossibly, skin at the corners of his mouth splitting with soft, wet sounds, revealing more of those infant teeth grinding together. Violence is unnecessary. My son, we are all servants of the same master. The crucifix's bleeding intensified, rivulets running down the wall like stigmata on plaster. The bourbon bottle on my desk frosted over, cracking with a sharp pop. Clive scrambled backward. Boss, his reflection, I see it. The bishop, no. The thing wearing Bishop Lorenzo Moretti's skin. I'd seen his face in the leaked files from Elias. One of Rinaldi's inner circle took another step. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight. He was lighter than air, or heavier than sin. Matteo laughed then, low, broken, from the floor. You fools, he rasped, lifting his head, his eyes, brown, human, ancient, were wrong now, glowing faintly, like coals under ash. You think he's the monster? The bishop's eyeless reflection turned toward Matteo. The second tongue flicked out longer, tasting the chains. Matteo smiled with teeth that hadn't been there before. I brought it here, not as prisoner, as shepherd. The twist hit like a blade between the ribs. Matteo, the broken priest we'd nursed, bandaged, protected, wasn't the victim. He was the host, the original. Dead since chapter 1, since collapsing on our doorstep with upside-down crosses in his eyes and a warm seal on the case. The thing had worn him like a disguise, playing wounded lamb while we guarded the one relic that could hurt it. The tongue nailed to the true cross splinter, the cork in the bottle, all of it theater, the escape from Rome, the warnings not to open the case, the tears, the prayers, the Latin whispers, bait. We'd kept what was promised, delivered it right into waiting hands. The bishop's body jerked then, like a puppet with cut strings, skin splitting along the seams of the cassock, revealing something wet and black and glistening underneath. The second tongue retracted with a slurp. The smile widened until the cheeks tore. Mateo's body on the floor convulsed, chains snapping like dry twigs. He rose. No, it rose, shedding the priest's form like old skin. The real Mateo had died in Rome, or maybe years before. What stood now was taller, limbs elongating with cracks of bone reshaping, cassock hanging in tatters, the crucifix shattered, glass and blood rained down. Clive screamed. I fired. The bullet punched through the bishop's borrowed chest, exiting in a spray of black ichor that hissed where it hit the floor. The thing that had been Mateo laughed with 1,000 voices, popes, cardinals, screaming children. You kept it safe for me. The tongue in the safe began to scream. Chapter 8. The Rite of 1614 performed in a failed Chinese restaurant. You've followed me this far through the knock, the tongue, the Polaroids that developed in blood, the tapes that spoke my name in dead voices, the phones that rang with inverted prayers, and the moment we realized we'd been guarding the wolf in sheep's clothing the entire time. If you're still here, breathing hard, lights blazing, phone face down like it might bite, thank you, because this is the end, or what we thought was the end. The part where we fight back, where good triumphs, evil gets banished, and everyone goes home scarred but alive. Except sometimes the ritual works too well, and sometimes working means something entirely different. The thing that had worn Mateo like a rotten skin stood in the center of our office, shedding the last scraps of the priest's body the way a snake leaves behind something that almost looks human. Black ichor dripped from elongated limbs that bent wrong at the joints, pooling on the floorboards and eating through the wood with a hiss like acid on flesh. The air reeked of scorched incense and rotting lilies, the smell of 1,000 papal funerals crammed into one room. Clive was backed against the wall, his grandmother's rosary wrapped so tight around his fist the beads had cut half moons into his palm, blood trickling between his fingers. The bishop's corpse, what was left of it, lay crumpled near the door, face collapsed inward like a deflated mask, purple cassock deflating as whatever had filled it vacated the premises. I still had the gun, 6 rounds left, pointless, but the weight felt like the only real thing in the room. The entity tilted its head, Mateo's head, but stretched, elongated, the jaw unhinging with a wet pop until it hung to the sternum, where the eyes should have been, only voids, deeper than the confessional Polaroids, swirling with red dots like distant cardinals watching from hell. You kept what was promised, it said again, but now the voice was layered, a choir of every pope since the Avignon Schism, speaking in perfect, overlapping Latin that made my ears bleed warmth down my neck. The lingua peccatoris, the cork pulled, the keys returned to their rightful keeper. Clive's voice cracked. Boss, what do we do? There was only one thing left, the forbidden rite, the Rituale Romanum of 1614, the one Pope Paul VI suppressed after it killed 3 exorcists in a Venetian monastery in 1947, their bodies found flayed by invisible hands, tongues nailed to the altar with splinters from the true cross. The Vatican had burned every copy, except one. I'd kept a photocopied fragment, smuggled out by a desperate seminarian years ago, tucked in the false bottom of my desk drawer next to the bourbon and the 38 reloads. I didn't ask permission. Didn't pray for forgiveness. I just moved. Clive, salt circle, now. He didn't argue, grabbed the industrial canister we kept for demon jobs, poured a ring around the entity thick as winter roads in Minnesota. The thing watched, amused, as the grains hissed where they touched its feet. I dragged the ossuary from the shattered safe, the titanium case long gone, splintered like toothpicks. The blackened tongue inside writhed, still pinned by the true cross fragment. But now it bled constantly, a steady stream that smoked on the velvet. The entity laughed, a sound like cathedral bells drowning in blood. I opened the photocopy with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The Latin was archaic, brutal, words designed not to plead with evil, but to rip it out by the roots. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I began, voice steady, even if my soul wasn't. The clock on the wall, the one that had survived every other horror, ticked over to 3:33. The rite demanded blood, salt, fire, and truth. We had all four. Clive lit the candles, black and red, stolen from a Santeria shop in Miami during a Rougarou case. The flames burned backward, sucking light into themselves. I sliced my palm, let the blood drip onto the tongue. It screamed, a high, keening sound like a child being born wrong. The entity lunged, but the salt held, for now. I read faster. The words tasted like rust and communion wine gone sour, each invocation a hammer blow. The thing convulsed, its borrowed skin splitting along the seams, revealing something underneath, not flesh, but layered vestments, thousands of them, chasables and mitres and papal tiaras fused into living tissue. It listed sins as I chanted, every pope since 1303, their secret perversions and murders and heresies recited in their own voices, overlapping into a cacophony that made Clive drop to his knees, vomiting bile and terror. Clement Vieu's betrayal of the Templars for French gold, John the Ritaite's necromancy in the Avignon palace, Alexander VI's incest with his daughter. The voices rose, accusing, damning, until the air itself seemed to curdle. Something began to tear, not metaphorically. The entity arched backward, spine cracking like gunfire, black feathers, huge, raven, dripping ichor, erupted from its back in a storm that shredded the remaining Polaroids into confetti. Latin screams filled the room, not from its mouth, but from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the bleeding crucifix shards embedded in the carpet. The tongue in the ossuary ignited, not from our candles, spontaneously, blue flame racing along the blackened muscle, consuming it whole. The true cross splinter glowed white hot, then shattered into dust, a final, wrenching pull like the world inhaling, and something was ripped free. It poured out of the Mateo thing in a torrent of shadow and feathers and screaming papal faces, coalescing into a formless mass that howled with 1,000 stolen voices before imploding into nothing. Silence, absolute. The salt circle smoked. The entity, what was left of Mateo's body, collapsed into ash that spelled a single word on the floorboards: liar. Clive was crying or laughing, hard to tell. I sank to my knees, the right pages fluttering from blood-slick fingers. We'd done it. We'd won. Except the ashes in the ossuary, the tongue reduced to gray dust, shifted, formed letters, not in Latin, in English. Thank you for the delivery. The safe door, mangled from earlier, hung open. The lock was intact now, brand new. The key on my ring didn't fit anymore. Someone had changed it from the inside. While we prayed, the Vatican hadn't sent Matteo as victim or bait. They'd sent him to deliver the tongue to someone who could pull the cork, someone outside their control. Me, the ashes whispered, soft as a lover's promise. The keys are yours now. Adam, if you were in my shoes right now, would you open that safe again, or burn the whole building down and pretend you never heard the knock? Because whatever's in there next, it has my name on it, and it's been waiting a very tease.